episode 4 of the Music of Middle-earth. My name is Jordan Rennells, and I'm a teacher and musician, and I will be your host. If you've heard my first episodes, you know that we get into the details of how Howard Shore built this amazing score, and also how Tolkien's images, ideas, and themes are portrayed through the music. It all comes from the professor's work itself, of course, so we'll be referencing that as much as we can as we go through. There are nearly 100 themes that Shore created for The Lord of the Rings, so we're really just starting the journey, and there really is so much more to come. So if you enjoyed these episodes, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so other people can get a chance to check it out as well. As always, our rough guide and outline through these episodes is going to be Doug Adams' book, The Music of the Lord of the Rings. A really amazing book and resource, so definitely check that out in the show notes. And now here we are at the end of all things, for Howard Shore's ring themes at least. It has been an awesome journey exploring the One Ring. We will definitely hear elements of it throughout future episodes, especially when we get to Gollum down the road. But in today's episode, we finally get to explore the Fate of the Ring theme, the last of the group of 4. So let's have a listen. Very exciting. I do want to talk about the next episode before we get into anything, though. Oh, and before I forget, we actually do have a question at the end of this episode as well, so stay tuned for that at the end. So episode 5 is going to be something different, but very special. Every 5th episode, or possibly more once we kind of get into things and see if you guys like it, there's going to be an episode dedicated to sound design. We're going to be having a reading from one of Tolkien's books, accompanied with sound effects and music and Foley. And what's really exciting about this actually is that it'll be your chance to get your voice heard on an episode. I'm really excited to be able to have other members of the Tolkien community join in for these episodes in the future, so stay tuned on how you can have a chance to do that and be a part of it. I'll explain all those details in episode 5. All of the sound effects and music will be created and molded by myself, so I'm really looking forward to doing that. The first episode is already done, and it was a lot of fun making it. I really think you'll enjoy it a great deal. I'm also always looking for future suggestions for other passages that you guys might want to hear. So if you have a beloved section from any of the books that you'd love to hear music and sound design with, send me an email at MusicofMiddleEarthMail@gmail.com. All right, with all that being said, let's dig deep. This episode, we get to put all of the pieces together for this final theme for the One Ring. The Fate of the Ring theme is, of course, its own theme, but it has aspects of all of the other ring themes within it. So we hear this one not in its entirety, but just as a small hint of hope maybe, in the Two Towers. During the scene, The Heir of Numenor, Gandalf and Aragorn discuss their enemy and the state of their quest. Just as Gandalf tells Aragorn that the ring remains hidden, we hear that hint of the Fate theme swell up behind them. The theme doesn't get to its full ending in this scene, though, as Doug Adams points out. The ring's fate hasn't necessarily been sealed yet, and so to exemplify that idea, the music doesn't reach its full conclusion. Little things like that are really why I want to do this podcast, small elements that just enhance the storytelling. Now, every time we go back and watch the movies, hopefully we will pick up a little bit more on this hint of a theme, a little bit more on this moment, and maybe it'll hit differently. And I definitely think it'll mean so much more to us when the theme finally comes home in its full rendition as the Tower of Barad-dûr falls. This theme is a lot more involved than the other themes are, so we've got a nice big discussion later. Let's dive into the history and legendarium of this theme to start, though. There are 2 main ideas that I want to talk about with this theme. The first idea is the conversation of whether or not the ring's fate has been sealed, and is it destroyed by chance? This leads to one of my favorite topics of discussion in Tolkien's work, especially in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also in stories like The Fall of Gondolin. The idea of fate and free will. The beginnings of that discussion can easily be summed up by this quick quote from Tom Bombadil. Just chance brought me then, if chance you call it. The second idea that the discussion of chance leads us to is Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe. This is displayed so well by Shore in the music. I loved revisiting this theme in particular in that lens. Let's dive into that word eucatastrophe to start with. This is a word that was, as many of us have heard, invented by Tolkien. I'll read from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. The consolation of fairy tales has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale, and its highest function. I'll go on to read a small section from Letter 89 to Christopher Tolkien from Humphrey Carpenter's collection. Tolkien writes, "All of a sudden I realized what it was, the very thing I was trying to write about and explain. For it I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears." I love this idea of the eucatastrophe, the sudden change from bad to good. The moment when Barad-dûr falls, when everything looks to be at the final hour and all hope is lost. With fairy stories, I really think we're looking for that feeling. We want to feel like everything is lost and to have it turn at the last moment. I think a key part of making this happen, though, is the realistic presentation of that sudden turn. The real eucatastrophe of the Return of the King is Gollum taking the ring, succeeding. Frodo and Sam and all of our characters have lost at this point, only to have Gollum slip and fall, and the eucatastrophe unfolds. I think it's important to see that the whole story leads to this moment, however subtly, to the idea that really it could have gone either way, but in this moment, Gollum is led by accident, by fate, or by chance, if chance you call it, to fall into the fires. It could have ended the other way, but in this last moment, the eucatastrophe unfolds, and that is a fairy story ending, as Tolkien would have it. There's so many examples of eucatastrophe in film, movies like The Shawshank Redemption or Saving Mr. Banks and Braveheart, stuff like that. Now, I think it is important and worthwhile to separate this idea of eucatastrophe from a deus ex machina. The most simple distinction I can make between the two types of storytelling would really be that eucatastrophe is a sudden switch from bad to good, something that could very well have been aimed towards and foreshadowed during the story, something that just tips the scales, whereas a deus ex machina is more of a scenario where the characters are powerless to what's happening and there must be some involvement or intervention from a higher power. Some unanswerable question is answered by a higher level of power in the story, or a somewhat inexplicable stroke of luck. Something like Harry Potter pulling the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat, after just being healed by magic phoenix tears. Now, the next topic that I want to get into for this theme is the idea of fate and free will. Really the idea of chance, just how Tom Bombadil describes it. I like thinking about life in the real world this way, so it's a really interesting conversation to have in Tolkien's universe. I see the idea of chance, or the lack of it in some scenarios, are really what lead us to the eventual eucatastrophe ending of the story. Was the ring meant to be destroyed? Did the higher powers that be, Ilúvatar, have a plan, a sort of guidance all this time? There are a few examples that I want to outline, and then we'll talk about them from a musical point of view later on in the episode. The Fate of the Ring theme really does an incredible job of getting into that feeling of inevitability and then fulfillment. The first section I'd like to read is from the Council of Elrond. Elrond says, "That is the purpose for which you are called hither. Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from distant lands. You have come and are here met, in this very nick of time, by chance it may seem. Yet it is not so. Believe rather that it is so ordered that we, who sit here, and none others, must now find counsel for the peril of the world." Now we parallel that to the section from Tom Bombadil. "Just chance brought me then, if chance you call it. It was no plan of mine, though I was waiting for you. I think it would be hard to read these lines and not have at least some thought of destiny or the hand of a Iluvatar floating in your mind. It really does bring a whole different feel and life to the story if you think of it that way. Believe rather that it is so ordered. I love the mystery and then the straight up contradiction that comes from lines like Tom's, though. It was no plan of mine, though I was waiting for you. We see other examples of this through the Legendarium as well, like Tuor being chosen by Ulmo. But for me, all of these examples come back to that one small idea that Gandalf brings up to Frodo in the Shadow of the Past chapter. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be so eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end. And when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. Gandalf sees that the ultimate fate of Gollum and the ultimate fate of the ring are still unknown. Even the very wise cannot tell. As we find out in the end, however, this small stroke of pity back in The Hobbit is what brings us that chance, that catastrophe in the end. To conclude on this point, I think the best way to think of this is that the characters are being guided by Iluvatar, I would say, but yes, they still have free will also. So the path is laid out before them. Something brought the characters together in the House of Elrond. Something brought Tom to the Hobbit's aid. But Tom chose to act. Bilbo chose not to kill Gollum. And therefore, the rest of the story was able to happen the way that it did. But it still could have gone the other way. So as we go to our mid-mark segment, hopefully we're thinking of the catastrophe, maybe a bit of guidance from that higher power, and maybe just a bit of luck and chance. How can we emulate these ideas and evoke that feeling in the music? Howard Shore really does an amazing job at portraying this, as we'll see. How this music is presented to us, with the hint of it being in the Heir of Numenor scene, and then the rest of it not being fulfilled until Barad-dûr falls, is also vital to the idea that it's trying to portray. So we'll be back soon to talk about all that, but let's dive into our mid-mark segment for today. All right, so for today's mid-mark segment, I'm actually going to be joined by Rebecca Rovney. She is a Tolkien enthusiast and violinist from Texas. We got to chat a little bit about where her love of music and film composition comes from. And I will let you guys know that the audio quality, unfortunately, is a little bit less than the normal podcast, but I hope that you guys will enjoy it anyway. So I will switch over to that now. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me. Why don't you kind of just take a second and introduce yourself to people and let us know what you're all about?
Sure. My name is Rebecca Rovney. I'm a violinist. I'm a teacher and student of violin. I've grown up classically trained, but my favorite genre of music is actually film scores. That's really where my passion lies. Though I do love classical music, but my connection is with film scores. So naturally, I have taken to one of the trilogies that has the greatest film scores of all, which is The Lord of the Rings.
Definitely.
And even before I started playing the violin, my mother would read aloud The Hobbit to me and my siblings. So I really don't remember a time before I didn't know Tolkien. It's just kind of part of what I've grown up with.
That's really awesome. It's definitely I have that same kind of feeling of just like knowing the stories already. Mm-hmm. The score, do you think, is your favorite, and why?
That's really, really hard.
I know.
I think as far as the leitmotifs go, I'm going to go with the theme from Rohan, because I've always felt a connection towards the men in Lord of the Rings, and I think Howard Shore really captured the feel through the motif for Rohan, and it's very simple, but it's very impactful, and it's very similar to Eowyn. You have this solo voice just speaking out loudly, and it resonates well like that. But as far as a piece of music goes, I think I'm going to have to go with the Breaking of the Fellowship.
Yeah.
That one gets me every time.
Definitely. It's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine this with any of the themes, but it's hard to imagine Rohan especially without that theme being the piece of music that plays. It hits so hard.
Yeah.
For sure. And I guess as a violinist, it makes sense as well that you would like that one.
Yes, I feel a connection to it.
So if you had to choose one piece that is combined with the scene that it's in, which piece would you think is the most impactful throughout the movies?
Throughout the movies?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Like combined with its scene.
Combined with its scene, okay. This is going to seem kind of strange. It's not because it's not exactly a story point or something like that, but I'm going to say in the extended edition, when you see the elves passing and they're singing Elbereth Gathoniel, and you hear that composition for it, I think, while I'm not the biggest fan of how it sounds musically, I don't really take to Byzantine or Gregorian style pieces of music, but immediately what it does is it tells you what the elves, who they are. It gives you a feel for them and how they're different and how their immortality and their whole history separates them from us, how we personally feel in our mortal lives. So I think I'm going to have to go with that, because just immediately, without any words, without knowing anything prior, you hear that piece of music and you see the elves walking by, and you know, oh, this is something different.
Yeah, here we go. Exactly. That's awesome. Cool. Well, my last question then is, what is your favorite non-Tolkien soundtrack and why?
Okay, I know this is an answer that I know very well. My favorite non-Tolkien soundtrack is the score to Braveheart by James Horner. That score just, it's so amazing. I don't know how James Horner did it, but somehow when I listen to that score, I feel the story of the entire world, of every single person. I feel like he captured the entire human experience in one score. And the funny thing is that I don't even like all of it. There's some of it there I think, that's not exactly my style, but that's how our perception is. It's how our perception of ourselves is and how our history of the world is. It's not perfect. Yeah. So there's just something about it that really resonates with me, so much so that I will listen to a bagpipe for hours on end. Normally, I will not at all.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure we'll hear from you again.
Thank you for having me.
Finally, time to dive into the theory of this theme. So let's take a good listen again. So this one is for full choir, and it actually has a poem to go along with it. I did my best to recreate the poem with this word builder function that I have on my program. Not super ideal, but it definitely gets the idea across, so forgive me for that. I'd like to first talk about how this theme appears in that Heir of Numenor scene that we discussed earlier. So we hear this theme in that scene. It happens right as Gandalf says, "But for all their cunning, we have one advantage. The ring remains hidden." Gandalf has just finished telling us, and Aragorn, the really grim state that their future looks to be in. But with this line, things begin to change. We hear the theme start to blossom through. It doesn't have its proper ending, however, and this is where we hear what Doug Adams was talking about. The ring's fate is still up in the air, so it's reflected in the music by not having a clear ending. Now, if we fast forward to the end of the films, we do get to hear this theme in its full potential. The fate of the ring is decided. The first thing I'd like to talk about is how we can hear the elements of the other ring themes within this one. We start by seeing that this theme is taking that same instrumentation and choral approach as the seduction theme. It makes it feel a little closer to the ring itself. The seduction made things feel intimate and close with the use of the boys' choir. So we get that same idea here and same emotional pull, just built up into a full choral treatment. Let me play those two themes back to back. Next, we see that the first few pitches also follow the history theme. I'll play the beginning of the history theme on piano, and then I'll play the beginning of the fate theme right after. Exactly the same pitches here, just presented in a different rhythm. It's really interesting how you can take these same notes and play them with slightly different lengths to create a different feel, but still have us be reminded of what's happened before and what we've heard before. Now, we didn't talk about this before when we looked at the evil theme because I wanted to save it for here, but if we listen to the contour of the evil theme, we actually hear the contour that comes through the history theme as well. By extension, we then have the same contour here in the fate theme. I'll play both the evil and history themes so that you can hear that, and then I'll play the beginning of the fate theme after that. Now, Howard Shore does such an amazing job here of taking what we know and what we've heard before, subconsciously or not, and just pushing it a little further past in a direction we're not expecting. Things start off familiar, but we're taken somewhere else, somewhere hopeful. Now, we're going to do something here that I don't usually want to do, but there really isn't a way around it for this theme. We're going to jump way ahead to a theme that will come up way, way down the road when we get into our Middle Earth group of themes. This theme is entitled Evil Times. Just a small rendition of it, though, not the full version yet. As As you can hear, it definitely resembles the contour and the same feel as these three evil, history, and fate themes. The evil times theme is used as a means to get from the history theme to the evil theme a lot of the times in the score. We'll get into that more obviously when we get to the evil times episode, but for now we just want to check out the notes that are involved here and how they relate to the fate theme. This is a really interesting place to explore an idea of what I would call reharmonization, where we take a song and we put it into another version, another mode as we call it in music theory. To start off with, let's use a major scale. Now we can think of each of these notes as numbers. C is number 1, D is number 2, E is number 3, F is number 4, etc., etc. So using these numbers, or scale degrees as they're commonly called, we can play a song and match a number to each note. 1, 1, 2, 1, 4, 3, 1, 1, 2, 1, 5, 4. So most of us will probably be familiar with this as happy birthday, but now if we take that same number pattern and change the mode or the version of the scale that we're using, we get a different sound. I'm basically just taking a different selection of notes and applying the same number sequence to them. Interesting. So it still sounds like happy birthday, kind of, but there's something a little off about it, a little bit of a different color. When we use this technique, we can really make it sound like we're hinting at something else, some other piece of music that maybe we're familiar with, but also giving it a different edge, a different feeling or emotion. So we hear the fate theme play these notes. Then we compare that to the evil times notes. Again, kind of the same feel, but in a darker and much more sinister tone. So amazing to see how all these themes work together to make a cohesive and intertwined musical landscape for the films. Alright, so time to talk about catastrophe. When we listen to the theme, it starts off somewhat dark and foreboding. It reminds us of the history theme. The notes between the choir are all tense still. As we hit the fourth bar, however, things take a turn. This is the catastrophic moment in the music. Shore changes keys or modulates from where we began, an E minor chord, onto a brilliant sounding A major chord. Let's take a listen to those two chords on the piano side by side. We get something dark and somewhat somber, and then switch to something so nice and brilliant. It really makes it feel like we're overcoming something. The battle is won. Now, if we listen to all of the chord changes that happen in this song, or groups of notes changing, I'm just going to stack all of the notes on top of each other without any of the kind of in-between notes that we hear, and give you a sense of what's happening on the piano so we can hear all the changes clearly. As we listen, I want you to focus on that building sense of accomplishment, the growing brilliance that comes through with each new chord, until that last chord where we really have finally gotten to the end of this long journey. Now, one last thing that I want to point out is another callback to the other themes. In the history and the evil themes, we have this rising half step. Half step, by the way, is just when you hit one note on the piano and then the next note right beside it, the next closest note. Those first two notes of each theme, that's the rising half step. But now in this fate theme, we get these steps ever growing higher and higher, finally fulfilling the wish of those themes and actually hinting at this same quality that comes from the seduction theme as well. Let's listen to just the melody of the fate theme so that you can hear that building. It finally climbs and continues to climb higher and higher until that last brilliant note. All right, so that almost wraps it up for this episode of The Music of Middle-earth. In this theme, we got to hear the evil and the history and the seduction themes, influences on the fate theme, how Howard Shore took phrase contours, pitch content, and instrumentation as inspiration for this final theme for the One Ring. We also got to hear how Tolkien's ideas of chance and fate, and then therefore catastrophe, has been embodied by this theme of Shore's. Now, before we get to listen to what our next theme will be, we actually have questions that need answering. We have a question today that comes from Matt B. in Minnesota. Matt says, I'm wondering if you could explain the idea of musical themes in movies. Where does that idea come from? When did movies start using themes? And how do movie makers decide what gets a theme? This is a really great group of questions from Matt. So where does this idea of the theme come from? If we go back and check out the idea of themes, we really have to take a step even further back to the idea of actually scoring a film in general. The first film with a totally original score was the silent film The Assassination of the Duc de Guise in 1908 by classical composer Camille de Saëns. You should really check this music out, by the way. I'm going to play a small sample of it here, but the link is going to be in the show notes. So from this point on, we get composers building scores specifically for their films. The first commercially released soundtrack comes years later, though, with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the idea of actually using themes, though, or more historically leitmotifs, comes from opera. You would start an opera off with an overture. This would lay out these themes or leitmotifs that would be developed later throughout the opera. These could be for characters or for places or for ideas. Now, if we look a little bit more broadly over the years of film, we definitely see many, many different amazing scores and also different styles of composition. We get brilliant themes that are used more for entire groups of people or sides of the story. For example, we have the Imperial March from Star Wars. That isn't really designed for just one character, whereas in Shore's score, we definitely get character-specific themes like those for Gollum. So it definitely depends on what the composer and director want or what the film calls for. Some amazing scores like that of Dunkirk are not theme-based really, but more effect-based. They're trying to get a feeling out of you, tension and release. Music is a tool for the filmmaker, so they have to decide how they're going to use it. And sometimes no music at all is really the best choice. It really all comes down to what the director and the composer want. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, Matt. And definitely if anyone else has questions, feel free to ask away. Now, next episode, as you know, we're going to be doing something very special and a little different. I'm excited to get to that. But in episode 6, we'll be moving completely and setting up shop in the wonderful world of the Shire. We'll be there for a pretty long while, so get comfy. Here's the first of many themes that we'll be exploring in the world of the hobbits and the Shire, the pensive setting. So excited to talk about everything west of Brie. Now, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas about today's episode, feel free to send me an email at themusicofmiddleearthmail@gmail.com or send a message to the Facebook page. You can find it if you search Music of Middle Earth. It really has been amazing to see how the podcast has grown in these first 4 episodes, and I'm really thankful to all of you for listening and helping it grow. If you really enjoy the podcast, leave a review or share it in your Tolkien Facebook groups. This is really the best way to get the word out there and let other people hear about the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.